basically what I propose to do is not give a definitive history of the of second wave feminism from start to finish, or even a definitive analysis of how exactly we should understand that movement, but rather to explore some ideas. It was, in its own way, perhaps a kind of a feminist idea, throw some ideas around. And see what people think. And really, just using the opportunity to go back and look again at, how second wave feminism came about, what the ideas were, how the left responded, and I suppose as well, like to look, and I think that I'll leave this for people themselves who've actually had some connection with socialist feminism in the left today, to respond in terms of the arguments you've been having, or how what you understand it to be. Anyway, obviously the first important thing to say is, in terms of the antecedents of feminism, you only have to look at the situation for women in the 1950s to understand just how oppressed women were during that period of history. You look at the United States, at Britain, at Ireland, at the major European countries, and women went from being involved in the workforce during the Second World War to basically being tied to the kitchen sink. You look at all the adverts of that time in terms of the role of women. They all inevitably had aprons on, greeting their husband home after a hard day's work to massage his ego and feed his belly, and obviously cater for all his other needs while never catering for her own. It was kind of the unspoken in the coffee mornings across America, and the meetings of women all over, I would say, the world, and certainly Western Europe, certainly women who'd gone through the struggle of the Second World War, who'd been actually out in the workplace, now to find their roles so much of a second-class citizen. Betty Friedan, a woman who set up the first women's rights organisation in America in the 1960s, talked about it as the thing that dare not speak its name. It was there, it was present everywhere, but it was never properly, voiced. And this goes also for the left. I don't know if anybody here has read Doris Lessing, in particular her book, The Golden Notebook. It's been a pretty difficult read in lots of ways, but it's very interesting. Look at the left during that period of time, because not only had the lefts got a very questionable attitude on the issue of socialism, what was happening, obviously Czechoslovakia, Hungary, these things that were happening, the role of Stalinism, particularly obviously in the question for the Communist Party, but how women were treated in the parties. Women were told generally, basically, women's liberation, yeah, well, that's for the future. In the meantime, basically, let's just get on with what we've always been doing, which in reality meant most of the time them making the cups of tea in the kitchen, them not playing the leading roles, them not being on the central committees, not in the leadership of organisations, and certainly not treated seriously. And this question was not treated seriously. So when the civil rights movement began in the United States in the 1960s, many women at the time, particularly the students and in academia, which is really where it came from, saw this as an important opportunity to actually, use for their own struggle. But they were soon to be very disappointed in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was active in terms of the campaign against racism for the Black Civil Rights Movement. There was enormous sexism, and women they went south. Everybody went south to take part in the struggles in the south of America against racism and for civil rights. They encountered a great deal of backwardness, including from black men that were coming into those struggles, that were becoming involved active in their own struggle for civil rights. And these men basically treated women, again, as second-class citizens, and many of the women there found it extremely difficult. And on one occasion there was a paper written in 1964 by some women activists in the civil rights movement, and the response from this very famous quote from Stokely Carmichael, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, was that the only position for women is the prone position, the only real position that women should be in. Then the anti-Vietnam War campaign, the organisation in that, the Students for a Democratic Society, again there were arguments within that from women involved in that organisation for equality, and they raised some points at one particular conference where they had a women's liberation workshop, and apparently they were actually driven off the stage, not because some of their ideas were, wrong, which plenty of them were, but basically from a right-wing chauvinist position. So out of left-wing chauvinist position. Well, left-wing chauvinist position, yes, but a conservative position, okay. And this led to the first rebels from that, women like Shulman Firestone, who's famous, wrote a book called The Dialectic of Sex, and Joe Friedman and others, who formed the women's liberation movement in the United States. Now, Britain in the 1960s was a different phenomenon. There weren't the same civil rights, there wasn't the same civil rights movement. The left and the workers' movement was much stronger. But what happened, would appear to me, is that women in and around the left became influenced by the ideas of Shulman Firestone, Juliet Mitchell and other feminist writers in the United States, and started to raise these questions themselves within their own organisations and within their trade unions. Essentially they started to raise questions about the role of women within the revolutionary movement, the role of women within the struggle for socialism. Sheila Rowbottom, Lindsay Gallen and Henry Wainwright wrote a book, again most people I'm sure, well, plenty of people will have known, called Beyond the Fragments, Feminism and the Making of Socialism in 1979, which I think summarises quite well many of the questions that were being raised by women at the time. Firstly, they argued that the left at the time was that women weren't treated like equals in the left, essentially, that the left was sexist, that the left wasn't aware of its own sexism. And they said, like, well, if this is the case, if this is the kind of organisation we're belonging to, how can this organisation bring about socialism? What sort of socialism will it bring? How, if it's exactly the same, if it remains unchanging from now, as an organisation from now up to the revolution, how can it emancipate women? How can it bring that about? They said it's impossible. They also raised the fact of the absence of women from leading roles in the organisation, and also, I think this is an important question, the fact that women in socialist countries had not been liberated. And there was some research conducted into women in Cuba, women in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, which showed quite clearly, it's something we all know today, that women in the Soviet Union, women in Eastern Europe and other so-called socialist countries were not liberated. And although they had far more of a role in the workplace than women in the 1950s did in Britain and in the United States, they actually suffered a double burden in that they had to work and then go home and do all of the housework at home, as well as look after their family. That even, in terms of how can I describe it, the Mother Russia concept, all the role of women in society in those countries showed that women were not, as they saw, these feminists or women's rights activists at the time, that women were not necessarily emancipated by socialism. They also raised the fact that there was an absence of women's rights and the question of women's oppression in the programmes and activities of left-wing organisation. From this, then they extrapolated the idea that class didn't explain everything, that it wasn't just class that was needed if you were to deal with the question of women's oppression, that you needed something else. The Leninist form of organisation, they said, was a male form of organisation. It was exclusive. It didn't allow for women to develop and come forward and play leadership roles. And it necessarily reflected society. It necessarily reflected the people who created that organisation, who were mostly men, and men of a particular frame of mind, they would have said. Also, they said Marxism didn't deal with the question of women's oppression, at least didn't adequately deal with the question of women's oppression, that Marxism ignored the realm of personal experience that for these women activists was so important. And again, as I've just said, that socialism and maybe in some respects this maybe was one of the most fundamental things, that looking at Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they said, well, it doesn't guarantee women's emancipation, so socialism cannot be our only way, socialism cannot be the only road for us. But the strategy, and I suppose what I'm trying to explain, is that in the United States, feminism came out of the civil rights movement. In Britain, it came out of the left. So it wasn't that feminism came along to the left, feminism came out of the left. And that their strategy, therefore, in general, and I mean, there were radical feminists, and, you know, there was the Society for Cutting Up Men, and this kind of, these kind of trends, radical feminists. And I mean, that's obviously most extreme lot, but anyway. But in general, I would say that it was connected with the left, and that what they tried to do, what they tried to argue for, was a marriage of socialism and feminism. They analysed the problem in society, and not just the feminists in Britain, but the feminists in the United States before them. They adopted some of the ideas of patriarchy. And the idea of patriarchy, putting it very simplistically, was that there are two systems in existence. You've got the system of production, which is the factory, which is, you know, society creating goods, creating things, and the involvement in human society within that. And then there's the system of reproduction, which is, you know, basically the system of reproduction of children, of ourselves as human beings, and that women within that relationship are the unfree, whereas the worker in the capitalist in the system of production, they are the unfree. And I think this idea is based on a quote of Engels. I haven't got it exactly right, but it's something about all human struggle is about the struggle for production and reproduction. Julia Firestone, being more of a radical feminist than any of the others in Britain, called it the sex class system. And I'm just like throwing out a couple of these definitions because I think it's useful to look at them. Another, Kate Millett, who wrote a book called Sexual Politics, argued that patriarchy, and again I should say that patriarchy was, they would argue, a system which transcended all class societies, in the sense that it was present in all class societies. It wasn't just something that was particular to capitalism. It had existed prior to capitalism. That women's oppression, and I mean, I'm sure obviously we would agree that women's oppression is bound up with class society, but that anyway, that it could be described in the way that the older male dominated the younger male, and then the male dominated the female. They argued that the fundamental unit of patriarchy was the family, and that within the family, children are socialised into particular traditional social roles, i.e. girls are taught to play with dolls and look after, you know, daddies when mother's away, and boys are taught to play with guns and know that they go to war, that this is how it's carried on, this is how society reproduces itself. And that essentially, therefore, the family was a reactionary social unit and needed to be challenged. Firestone argued that women were at the mercy of her own biology, and she advocated, as I say, a sexual revolution, but she argued that women needed to take control over their own biology in order to become in any way equal. So essentially, there seemed to be like an accepted definition of Marxism, that Marxism was really just about economics, that, well, young Marx, well, he was good, but then older Marx came along, mature Marx came along, and he was about writing capital, he was about capitalism. He wasn't about, you know, the earlier kind of philosophical ideas, the ideas of emancipation, the ideas of self. Those things were missing, and therefore they argued those things were missing from Marxism as a whole, so therefore Marxism was inadequate. And needed to be added to. So they didn't, I think, in seeing it this way, in many respects, that they reflected the way the left saw Marxism at the time. You know, look, there you were, you had the Soviet Union, you had socialism, you had the Communist Party. You didn't have a situation where you could see people in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe actually running their own affairs. What you saw maybe is a little bit like, who was just talking about it yesterday, Jerry Downing, wasn't it, where people had the heating on every winter, or, you know, there was more food around than there is now, but people actually being emancipated, people living in a liberated way, that didn't exist. So Marxism was reduced to something quite sterile, and I think that feminism saw it like that, and then, but also even the you know, likes of, I mean, Mike can add his two pennyworth about the IMG, but certainly the Socialist Workers' Party, the IS at the time, to me seemed to see it like that, and the Communist Party seemed to see it like that. So the struggle for communism, the struggle for socialism, was one of quantity rather than quality. Anyway, I would say that the women's liberation movement in Britain, and this is really where I've looked at it, was never a very big movement. It was always essentially quite a small movement, but it did have influence. In the late 1960s and 1970s, various groups were set up, and I've read some personal accounts of those groups, and you can see how many of the ideas that they put forward led to their demise. In 1970, the Women's Liberation Movement had a conference, and there was a big row at that conference, I think about the role of men as also about other things. And after that, men were excluded. The following year, men were even excluded from the social, on the basis that sisters, we don't want to have men here at an event where we're, I don't know, discovering our own autonomy. And that the women who actually argued for men to be included were cowed by these kind of arguments. Okay, by 1975, there had come about an enormous number of splits and divisions within the movement. And as I said, you can see from the ideas they put forward how these splits and divisions came into being. And firstly, it was this question of the need for autonomy, and I suppose that still is one extremely important idea underpinning feminism and socialist feminism, i.e. that there should be women-only organisation, which shouldn't be controlled by the left-wing groups. Now, even the IS set up a women's voice at the time, which accepted that, and there was a women's only organisation. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that there's anything wrong with that per se, but I think the difficulty is that it left the women's question to women. It became women's specialism rather than men also having a say in it, you know, becoming involved, becoming interested in it. Do you know what I mean? Rather than being, well, that's just them. In a certain sense, it kind of replicated, in, you know, the other way, the inverse way, the problem in the 1950s. It wasn't really dealing with the question, wasn't really dealing with challenging the left. Then they also raised the need for a different kind of organisation. As I said, they were very critical of the Leninist form of organisation as they understood it, which was obviously very bureaucratic, and there wasn't openness within organisations. You know, we've talked about those things on different occasions. But the consciousness-raising groups that they set up, again, you know, nothing wrong with them per se, in the sense that maybe they would give women who weren't ever involved in politics, or maybe had been involved in politics for years and years, but had been sitting in the back of the room and never said anything, an opportunity to start to express themselves, start to share their ideas in an environment which was safer to them psychologically than they would be used to. But I think what happened with it is that it became way too focused on the kind of personal experiences, rather than actually really developing their political ideas, so that their political ideas remained, in general, I think, pretty lightweight. You know, they didn't really use the opportunities. And then probably one of the fundamental problems for them in the end was the idea that the personal is political, that it's your experience is what's important, that you organise on the basis of your own oppression. So socialism was an economic struggle, and which would be led by the working class, and then feminism was a women's struggle, which would be led by women. Now, I'm not saying that they wouldn't have said that men should be involved in that, but it's essentially, there wasn't a class question in the same way as there was within the struggle for socialism. So then in the 1970s, I mean, you can see, like, for instance, I mean, obviously this publication, Feminist Review, didn't come into being until 1979, so in many ways was after the initial success they started to produce, and the attempt to do so was based on the idea that if they could begin to theorise some of these questions, that they could save the women's liberation movement at the time. And they tried to do things like incorporate, have some debates about the question of black feminism or lesbian feminism and what the problems were, because many black feminists, for instance Angela Davis, an American black feminist, had a lot of problems with the women's liberation movement in terms of their depiction, in terms of their campaigns for long prison sentences for rape, for instance, because she would say that black men in the United States were far more likely to be charged with rape than white men, and it was also an attack on black people and black women by attacking black men for. In that way she had issues, and also they would have said as well, black feminism in the United States, that the experience that they'd gone through as being slaves had created greater solidarity between black and white, black women and black men that existed in Britain. Then obviously lesbian feminists they would say they had a different experience. So instead of actually, and I know that Feminist Review did try and do it, but it seems to me that in the movement itself, rather than trying to debate these questions out, because you were organising on the basis of your own oppression, you split, and then you did your own. You had your own campaign, you had your own programme of action. It didn't stay together. So the splits and divisions, which is why I suppose in the end Sheila Rowbottom talks about beyond the fragments, overcoming the fragments of feminism, and re-establishing socialist feminism, which was her programme. Anyway, there was also within the idea of identity politics a hierarchy of oppressions. Who was the most oppressed? Who had the genuine experience? Eventually. The whole, within the late 1970s, obviously the coming to power of the Tory party, the move to the right of the women's liberation movement led to its incorporation within the trade unions and also within local government. Obviously Ken Livingstone was extremely successful with the GLC in making that a radical feminist local government authority, that he created spaces for different cultural activities, spaces for women's rights groups, this group there, these kind of things. It almost felt like, for them, that they actually didn't need the separate organisation, that local government was going to do it for them. And also, I would say, Labour Party feminism, many of them went into the Labour Party, and within this organisation, which was a male-dominated patriarchal organisation, they were allowed their own space and they could do what they wanted. They could say what they wanted within their own groups. They had their quota systems. And again, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the space question, they were therefore, many times concentrating on their own careers as well. Let's say there were many careerists came out of that. But for the genuine people that were involved in it, they hadn't just become careerists. They had, I think, ghettoised their struggle. That's how I would describe it, in the sense that it was constricted, it was constrained. Now, often, obviously, these committees could be very powerful, but they constrained the struggle for women's rights into committees, into groups within the overarching organisation, rather than making a central part of the key debates. Now, I just want to move on finally to, that won't be much longer, I'm hoping people will come in, to look at the question of how the left responded. So I've described how the left were in the 1950s, and I would say, the worst really were within the Communist Party. And it seems to have been the case that at first the leadership of the Communist Party resisted feminism, but then just went from a situation where it allowed that space, that autonomy for the likes of Beatrix Campbell and people like that. And then ultimately, in the 1980s, they actually used, the Euros used feminism as a way to move the party to the right. And people at the forefront of that were the likes of Beatrix Campbell, who actually was extremely anti-working class and argued against strikes as being a manifestation of male oppressive power, who argued that the miners were not to be supported, and that really, essentially, that in many respects the working class men were far worse than bourgeois men when it came to women's oppression. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't problems. I'm not saying that there aren't problems. Clearly, I am concerned. It is a concern. It is something that needs to be argued. But the problem with what Beatrix Campbell did and the Euros did is that they formally denounced any role for the working class and said that the whole thing was just about women, all women across every class. They were cynical. The IMG, again, I'd let Mike come in on that because I don't know very much about the IMG in that time, but it appears that the IMG incorporated many of the ideas of socialist feminism and did allow autonomy within the organisation, that there were women's only groups within the organisation. And again, I would be interested to hear from Mike how that what that led to. I am aware of some arguments that said that although the IMG did that it was kind of like business as usual in a lot of other ways, that they didn't really respond. They responded to the criticisms by allowing the self-organisation of women within the IMG, but that they didn't really take it any further than that. I mean, as I said before, that's like isolated pools within the same organisation. And then it's interesting to look at the response of the SWP, and as it was at the time, the IS, and Lindsay German has written, so it is a very boring book.
Truly dreadful.
Truly dreadful. Sex, Class and Socialism, and I think whatever event you go on, this is held up as the Bible on, women's emancipation. And Lindsay German is always introduced as the expert, as one of the leading women's rights activists in the 1970s. She walks onto the stage. Well, actually, from reading this and reading Beyond the Fragments, Sheila Rowbottom had been a member of the IS. It seems to me that she was actually the Hatcher woman, and that rather than being in the forefront of the struggle for women's rights, she was actually the one that was used to basically close down the women's voice organisations, clamp down on the struggle, and basically drive any of those advocates of women's liberation really out of the organisation or into silence. The IS was seen, I think, by many as part of the New Left because it wasn't part of the Trotskyist movement as such, because it had developed the idea of state capitalism and certainly wasn't part of the communist movement, of the Communist Party. Lindsay German describes how when they set up Women's Voice, it took on many of the ideas of autonomy and essentially caused a lot of problems for the SWP. She's critical of the leadership for not taking on these questions, but she also has a lot of other things to say. She begins the chapter on the women's socialist feminism with the quote from John Molyneux, a member of her organisation, and the quote says that basically that the women's movement was ignored by the left and was ignored by the Trotskyist left. Not true, she says, not true. It wasn't true. We were doing work on the women's question. She also says that it wasn't true that within the left that there was any sexism, that the men were socialists, and that basically they were not of the kind that the women in the United States had encountered, likes of Carmichael and others, and therefore there again wasn't a problem. She said it wasn't true that sex roles were forced on women, and that in fact often it is women themselves who force other women into sex roles. Obviously this thing happens, but that essentially it wasn't the men who were the problem. She is against the concept of patriarchy, and she says that Marx and Engels only meant it to describe production within the home, as another arena of production, rather than rather than being a system of reproduction in the way I've described it, where the family is reproducing itself. I just don't get where she's coming from on that. But she says the essential problem was that it was just all these middle-class women. None of them were really working-class women. All of them had the time to sit around doing their consciousness raising, whereas working-class women were busy getting on with their lives, getting on with men, going on strike, you know, having their struggles, and not being the same problem as the likes of Sheila Rowbottom and others were. She said if it wasn't for the fact of it being a middle-class organisation, they wouldn't have had that problem. So she also says that she criticises Women's Voice because she said that they turned away from class questions towards individual questions like male violence and like rape. These were individual questions. They're not, she doesn't describe these as social problems. They're not class questions, which, you know, gives you a good idea of how she understands the working class in terms of its role, in terms of its struggles. Class questions were about going on strike. Class questions were not about taking up, you know, social questions within the workers' movement or within society as a whole. Certainly class questions, the working class was not about the emancipation of women. The working class is about the emancipation of working class women. And working class women as workers. So women really, and it's often been said about the SWP, are like funny shaped workers. So I mean, what is useful for us to look at in terms of that whole struggle, that whole movement? I think that it would be too easy just to simply say, well, look, there you go. You know, that was all about identity politics, that was all about consciousness raising. Obviously the whole thing, you know, fell apart, or, you know, it's become a part of bourgeois society, part of local government. But I think that there are issues for us today. I think the problem at the time was the left, really, more than feminists in many respects, because the left didn't take up those questions in a serious way, and when they did, they only took on feminism. You see what I mean? They only took on the feminist ideas. They attached those, the IMG or the Communist Party. Clearly, I think that women at that time had the view, look, we don't want to wait for socialism to be emancipated. And we know that we look at socialism as it exists, and it isn't emancipating women. We want some emancipation now. And they didn't want to listen to the arguments that said, look, you know, you've got to wait, or things have to be organised as they are at the moment because they're more effective. It's definitely also the case, it must be the case, there are forms of organisation reflect reality. But we, on the left, must, I think, try to prefigure something of the future in terms of our relations with each other, in terms of our ideas of working together. We shouldn't, I'm not saying that we want to create a microcosm of socialism, because it's clearly that wouldn't be possible. But at the same time, we have to challenge how we work together. We have to challenge how we build our organisation. We have to challenge the fact that, you know, it's a sad case of affairs that we still have so few women involved in the left. So few. Women don't play a leading role in the left, and this is half of society you're talking about. This is the half of society that has got most to gain from socialism, from liberation. And, you know, we have to therefore, I think, consider our own working methods, consider our form of organisation, consider our culture. And it's certainly true that the organisations that Sheila Rowbottom was criticising were closed, were bureaucratic, there was no openness, and certainly there was no openness within the feminist organisations either, because they just split every time they had a disagreement. But she was criticising that. But she was also saying that we need to think about the future, think about the present, not just the future. And that we shouldn't simply accept the inevitability of oppressions within our own organisation, that we shouldn't just say we are just simply going to mirror society. And, you know, I don't particularly kind of have a problem with that. I mean, the idea of democratic socialism is obviously a very different thing to what she was criticising. But, you know, there's nothing wrong with actually asking the question, is the Leninist form of organisation the right one? If you're looking at all of these questions of the involvement, you know, has Marxism got all the answers? Now, I would say in terms of the issue of Marxism, clearly Marxism is a universal concept, it's a universal idea which obviously must take on and explore and develop and fight for emancipation as one of its central struggles. Socialist feminism cannot be tacked on. You cannot tack it on. It's, you know, it's impossible. It leads to an impossible situation, and I hope I've described where the two things again become separate, because they are seen as two separate spheres of struggle, although they're meant to be united. I mean, you know, the problem with socialist feminism, I think, is that, excuse me, it leaves a situation where men are in a supporting role, not in a central role. The struggle for communism sorry, sounds happened. Implies a struggle for all of us together in a united way, but within that, understanding and doing something about the social relations that exist within us today. So, what Mike's point about the 1979, about the Corrie Bill, I mean, as I admitted, I could see that the IMG had made an attempt, a substantial attempt, to connect with this movement rather than becoming coloured, you know, rather than becoming feminist or taking on feminism as the Communist Party did. But as I've read in terms of that struggle for the trade union TUC banner at the front of the march, yes, it involved the SWP, but also involved women who wanted to lead the march. Now, I'm not saying the TUC banner should have gone off and the women should have gone on, but I think that there should have been some recognition of the need for a unity. Do you know what I mean on that question? Because it is true, isn't it, that there's a question of women's emancipation as well, being self-emancipation, and I'm not saying it should just be women taking the lead in that, but I also think that women should take the lead in that, if you see what I mean. I think that it is important. I think that was a question that caused rancour, and I think that was unnecessary. So, and I agree, in terms of Yasmin's point about the left, that it's easy to criticise the left and like looking at the capitulation of the left in Iran. Well, I mean, I tried to make that point. I think that we shouldn't capitulate to it. I think that we shouldn't ignore it, we shouldn't capitulate it, we should do something else. We need to think about, and I'm not saying that I don't accept Leninist form of organisation or anything like that, but I do think that we still have a problem. You know, I'm not saying that I'm pointing to the fact that what the critics of the left at the time were talking about was a form of organisation that had no democracy, had no openness in it, and that made a difference. That made a major difference. So maybe yes, I mean, you know, maybe, you know, there is every need for us not to remain the same. There is every need for us not to remain static in our views on the question, because we can look back in the 1950s and criticise the left then until a movement came along. You know, do we need that? Do we need another movement to change? I think it is certainly true that, you know, patriarchy exists in some way, but it has changed, and it is important to understand. I mean, just on John McAnulty's point, I don't agree that in that sense that feminism came from capitalism. Feminism came from the struggle against capitalism. Feminism came from the struggle against the stultifying, you know, almost suffocating existence of women in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, I know women actually weren't in the workplace in general, were they, in the 1950s? They were thrown out of the workplace. Many married women weren't able to work. In Ireland, married women were, you couldn't work. You actually couldn't work, not even as a teacher, you couldn't work as far as, and although teachers did work, maybe illegally, I'm not sure, but I know, you know, I know my mother had to give up work, and you know, even the thing of not even actually having your own name. I mean, my mother was Mrs. Peter Mc.Shane. I mean, that's a weird thing, isn't it? Not having your name. I used to refuse to write a letter to her as Mrs. Peter Mc.Shane because I thought, you know, it's not her name. But like, I know these are small things, but they show the kind of culture that existed at the time. And I think I agree. We have come a long way, and that movement, which was a small movement, had tremendous ripples across all of society. I mean, it's even indicated, I think Sheila Rowbottom describes it, where even within its demise, and Spare Rib and all these other magazines were being run by, you know, a handful of people. The readership was actually pretty large. Women, you know, were reading these magazines. Women were interested, and people were interested in. And yes, it ended up in local government. It didn't have to. I think it didn't have to end that way. It is our collective responsibility as the left to analyse, not really in that sense, I think, why feminism was wrong, but why we as the left didn't manage to go anywhere with it at the time, either adapted to it or denied it. I think, I mean, just like lastly on this question of quotas, I mean, I agree that there are a lot of problems with quotas because it's an institution, it becomes institutionalised, and I don't like the idea myself of being promoted just because I'm a woman. I would want to be promoted because I have a talent or I'm able. But at the same time, I do need, and I think other women, and I did need, to be encouraged and to be taught how to speak, and to be taught how to stand up for my points, and to be taught how to deal with things. I wasn't able, I hadn't had that social experience. I'm not saying that all men have that social experience, but I do think that for women it usually is more difficult because we're not generally expected to take that role. So how do you get over those problems? Positive discrimination by using quotas was a method of getting over those problems, was a method, as Nick said, of addressing people's minds to the question. Now it can become, and has become, far too often a hollow, meaningless, formalistic, almost an insulting thing. Because you're a woman, you get to do it. I mean, I know, you know, all sorts of political bourgeois organisations use it, and I've got a friend of mine in Ireland actually who stood for Fianna Fáil, and she said it was just because she was a woman. She said afterwards, when she lost the election, they didn't want to know. She said it was the most humiliating experience, one from which she took a lot for her to regain her self-confidence. So there are a lot of problems with it. I'm not denying that. I'm just exploring it as, you know, I think it is something that can be used. The act of will, the consciousness, the awareness, you know, the kind of, we must be aware of the question, we must have positive discrimination, we must be active. Sometimes need some measures. You know, it can't just be a thing in your head. You need something to use. So look, I think I'll leave it there. I think, I mean, sorry, just in terms of the point about the programmatic the solutions on the question of the nuclear family. I think in the CPGB draft programme, I don't think that it's been updated in terms of the women's question. But the key point was the need for collectivisation, you know, of housework, of socialisation. Well, collectivisation, socialisation, it's kind of similar, isn't it? The need for 24-hour creche facilities, and it's just like my very final point is that it was actually also said by some of the socialist feminists at the time that that wasn't a good enough solution, that men should do housework too. But anyway, as I do none at home, I can't complain.